Hi, my name's Holly. I'm Cree Métis from the province of Manitoba, from a Métis community called St. Eustache, Manitoba. I was adopted shortly after birth. I've been asked to tell you my adoption story. For the most part, it's a really positive adoption story, and I'm incredibly grateful for everything that I've experienced and for all of my family that's still involved with me. At the same time, I think any adoption story, and certainly in the context of an Aboriginal adoption, has some elements of grief and loss, and certainly cultural loss. And mine does too. But I've been asked to tell you the journey that I've had with adoption, and where I am today with it. So I've been fortunate to have a relationship with my birth mother for most of my adopted life, and I've learned of my adoption story through her. Audrey was young when she found herself pregnant in Winnipeg. She left home very early, probably around 16, was pregnant by 17 in Manitoba, and this was an era near the end of the 60s scoop. I was adopted in the early 70s. I wasn't taken from Audrey, but certainly when Audrey presented herself to social service agencies, she wasn't given any other choice unless it was adoption. When she was pregnant, she began asking for help, and she was put in a home with other Aboriginal women, and they were all expected to give their babies up for adoption. And social workers had told her that would be what was best. There were no other options explored with Audrey. Certainly extended family or community wasn't explored as it would be today. It was understood that the best fate that I would have would be in an adoptive family. And I'm not necessarily negating that fact, but nonetheless, I know Audrey's lived experience was of grief and loss. Without having given her that clear choice, one of the first things Audrey told me when I was 18 and met her was that she cried every year on my birthday. For me, that was heartbreaking. I couldn't imagine somebody celebrating my birthday in tears. And that was really difficult to understand, that kind of grief and loss. But I think when Aboriginal women aren't given choices, that's the outcomes that can happen. So, the other thing that I wasn't given was any kind of cultural connection or family connection. In the early 70s, closed adoption was the only choice. No one talked to Audrey or my adoptive family about openness. That wasn't understood to be the best option for children at all. My family are incredible and loving and wonderful, and I'm entirely grateful for growing up with them. At the same time, I had no sense of identity or cultural connection. My parents knew the era that they were adopting me in, and in Winnipeg, it was somewhat common maybe, or somewhat thought, that I could be Aboriginal. My parents understood that, and the social worker mentioned it in passing that perhaps I was Aboriginal. But I wasn't raised with any cultural identity, and certainly didn't know what band or nation or clan I came from, and had no understanding of the history. My parents were open, and certainly I would say very non-racist, if not even pro-exploration and identity. But the innumerable times that I was asked throughout my childhood and even my adolescence and adulthood, oh, you must be Spanish or French or Mexican. Eventually I began to just say yes to whatever question anybody asked me, because I was so tired of not knowing the truth. I remember when I first met Audrey at 18 and learned of my Aboriginal identity and cultural identity, I cried. I cried because I knew I would have an answer to that question. I cried because I could finally answer that question honestly and truthfully. And it was then that I understood, probably at the age of 18, what a loss it was growing up without that. And now to be able to speak of that with pride and with celebration is an incredible gift. And to have been able to follow my roots back to my community is an incredible gift. And to understand the rich and complex history my birth family has had, and how they've survived in their nation and their community has been just so fulfilling and completing for myself that I understand only when I was given that gift how much I lacked that growing up. The other piece that I would say that was a huge loss for me was family and extended family. When Audrey and I first met, I swear I stared at her silently for minutes, watching her hand gestures that are very similar than mine, her silhouette that was very similar than mine, and for the first time having somebody mirror my expression, my identity, was incredible. I also learned the first time when I met Audrey that I had 3 other birth siblings. I cried then too, understanding that there were others that were like me. That was a gift. Um, we've had very different lives. They grew up with Audrey in different circumstances and somewhat tumultuous circumstances. And I'm closest with my birth brother Ryan. And still to this day, when we see each other and we start hand gesturing, I feel a deep love and connection for him. And I really believe vice versa. It was a loss not being able to grow up together. Absolutely. Sadly, Audrey passed maybe about 8 years ago now. And I was really entirely grateful to have her in my life from 18 until in my mid-30s. That was a gift. But it was a difficult divide to cross for us. I was certainly raised with opportunity and privilege and education, and Audrey, she wasn't resentful of that because she wanted all of those things for me, but there was a divide between us that was very difficult to cross. Audrey grew up speaking her language, a form of French, a mischief language, and I was excited to learn that and began at 18, 20 trying to have conversations with her at French. I learned French in school. But again, even our dialects were different. We couldn't even communicate because mine was a very educated, privileged French, and hers was this guttural, community-based French, and it was very difficult to understand each other. Often in our lives, it was very difficult for us to understand each other because we had such different upbringings. And because for me, I saw my own adoption as a celebration and as a positive thing. And for Audrey, it was such a piece of loss and grief and quite frankly oppression that it was difficult for us to come together. Since I met Audrey and learned of my cultural identity, I traveled back to my community, met some of my extended relatives, and all of that was an incredible gift. Having that sense of identity has been fantastic. However, as an adopted Aboriginal person, it's difficult to bridge the divide between not having lived experience as an Aboriginal person. Although I work for an Aboriginal agency and am entirely grateful for that, and surround myself with Aboriginal people and occasionally attend ceremony and things like powwow in the community or Aboriginal days, and travel to different communities, and I'm really grateful for all of those experiences. I still feel disconnected to a degree to my culture because I don't have lived experience, because I was raised without it, and those divides are hard to cross. So although I've had an incredible positive experience, and I would be loath to say I would change anything, there were two things that I would change. One, I would have been raised with a cultural identity. I would have known the place that I came from throughout my lifespan, and I would have been able to access that. And that would have shifted my identity, and it would have strengthened my cultural ties today. Secondly, I would have wanted to be raised with my birth siblings. Although I was grateful for my adoptive sibling, and he and I grew up in a very loving family in a very loving way, seeing now how close the three of them are, and seeing now how similar we are, and yet still there's a divide because we didn't have lived experience or shared experiences together, is a deep sense of loss for me. So in looking forward, when we look towards what needs to shift in the adoption of Aboriginal children, I would say that transparency and choice needs to shift. If Audrey was given supports from the time that she told social services that she was pregnant, we would have had a very different life, and we would have had a life together. I also believe that children have a right to their cultural identity, that shouldn't be taken through closed adoptions, that in fact the adoption of Aboriginal children shouldn't be closed, that if Aboriginal children are to be adopted by non-Aboriginal people, that should be done in openness and with a strong cultural plan, so there isn't a divide, and so we don't have different experiences. And finally, another comment about openness, that all siblings should have access to each other. Because they were born into different circumstances isn't their fault, and they should know each other and have opportunities to celebrate each other growing up. And so for me, I look forward to some form of a reconciliatory movement in Aboriginal adoption. I believe that every Aboriginal child deserves permanency, and equally, I deserve that they need strong cultural plans, a sense of an identity, and that they have inherent rights to their culture, to their family, to their lands, to their treaties, to everything that comes into terms with that. And that's my story.